3.04 seconds. The primary investigator from the Alliance Security Bureau slams his fist on the metal table, shouting the number into my face for what feels like the 100th time. The interrogation room is a sterile, brutally cold box buried deep within the security tier of the Aegis spindle. The light above us is a harsh, unforgiving white that makes the investigator's gray skin look sickly. He brings up the holographic projection again, forcing me to watch the recorded feed from the public concourse. He thinks the repetition will break my resolve. He thinks he is showing me the undeniable evidence of a cold-blooded murder. I watch the loop. I watch my cousin, Corin Thale, strike the human. I watch the sharp, cracking impact of the slap. And then I watch the human, Gunnery Sergeant Alara Vance, respond. The investigator pauses the feed right at the end of the violent blur, pointing a trembling finger at the frozen image of Corin collapsing to the deck. His life extinguished before the medical drones could even register the trauma. 3.04 seconds, the investigator repeats, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. That is all it took for that human savage to execute a high-born Cerevian noble in the middle of a crowded public square. It was a calculated, unprovoked assassination. I just stare at him. I feel a hollow, bitter laugh scraping against the back of my throat. But I swallow it down. He is an idiot. The entire galactic community is acting like a collective of idiots right now, screaming for human blood, demanding the immediate execution of the Marine, and threatening to blockade the Sol system. They are entirely consumed by the narrative of a fragile, elegant alien aristocrat who insulted a primitive soldier and paid the ultimate price in the blink of an eye. What they absolutely fail to comprehend, what I have been trying to force through their stubbornly thick skulls for the past 12 hours, is a truth so terrifying it makes my hands shake beneath the table. If Sergeant Vance had been even 3 seconds slower in her response, every single soul on this station, all 40 million of us, would be dead. That human did not commit a murder. She aborted an apocalypse. To understand how we reached the edge of total annihilation, I have to pull the timeline back. 2 days ago, my greatest source of anxiety was whether the human delegation would breach some obscure dining etiquette at the integration banquet. My name is Lyrax Thale. I serve as a senior protocol and legal adjudicator for the Cerevian Directorate. My role in our vast, ancient bureaucracy is typically an exquisite torture of formalities, treaties, and mind-numbing boredom. The Aegis spindle was supposed to be a neutral ground. It is a massive, sprawling deep space hub, an architectural marvel hosting millions of transient beings from dozens of star systems. Currently, it was serving as the venue for a monumental summit. The objective was to formally integrate the young, unpredictable human race into the broader Alliance security network. It was intended to be a highly structured, intensely routine affair. We anticipated endless hours of reviewing dense legal precedents, signing intricate trade annexes, and desperately maneuvering to ensure no one caused a catastrophic diplomatic scandal. Humans are newcomers to the deep black of the galaxy. Within the grand halls of the elder races, they are widely viewed as aggressive, unrefined, and useful only for their shockingly efficient military doctrines. My specific mandate was straightforward. I was here to herd the humans through the necessary ceremonial hoops, smile pleasantly for the swarms of press drones, and keep my prestigious family name entirely untarnished. Everything shattered the moment my idiot cousin Corin arrived. He did not travel quietly on a standard diplomatic transport. He arrived in a hyper-tuned, custom-built private yacht that practically screamed of our family's obnoxious wealth. His pilot blatantly ignored traffic control, displacing 3 massive cargo freighters in the queue just to secure docking at Prime Bay No. 7. Corin Thale was vain, spectacularly loud, and dangerously spoiled. Worse, he carried the absolute, suffocating authority of his mother, Matriarch Oressa Thale, draped over his shoulders like an invisible royal cape. When he strutted down the deployment ramp, He was flanked by heavily armed personal guards and wore spun silk garments that cost more than a newly founded human colony's entire annual gross domestic product. Just looking at him, I felt a familiar, agonizing migraine blooming behind my eyes. I cornered him in the private VIP lounge within 15 minutes of his grandiose arrival. I demanded an explanation. I needed to know why he was here, risking the disruption of a highly delicate diplomatic mission. Corin merely smiled. It was that infuriating, lazy smile he used when looking at something he considered vastly inferior. He swirled a glass of incredibly rare imported wine and leaned back against the plush seating. "I am simply here to observe the humans, dear Lyrax," he drawled, his tone laced with heavy condescension. "Mother wishes to know firsthand if these rudimentary apes are truly worthy of sitting at our table, or if they just belong on a short, heavy leash." I knew immediately that he was lying. Corin did not care a single fraction of a credit about interstellar politics, sociological observations, or the future of the Alliance, unless it directly inflated his bank account or stroked his monumental ego. As a legal adjudicator of my rank, I possess access codes to systems I technically should not touch. That evening, unable to shake the cold dread in my stomach, I bypassed the station's primary security firewall and initiated a covert audit of his ship's flight logs. What I discovered in the dark streams of data made my blood run entirely cold. His navigational records had been professionally scrubbed and replaced with a highly sophisticated forged overlay. Corin had not come straight from our homeworld as he claimed. He had made a significant, undocumented detour to a quarantined dead sector. Furthermore, the mass readings of his yacht upon arrival at the Aegis Spindle were off by precisely 42 kilograms compared to his departure mass. He was hiding something. He had brought something highly illegal on board, or perhaps he was carrying it directly on his person. However, the missing mass was not the detail that truly terrified me. The Aegis Spindle is an ancient construct. It is vastly older than the Alliance itself. It is a relic of an unknown precursor race, merely repurposed by us into a modern trading and diplomatic hub. It possesses a dormant, labyrinthine core system buried kilometers beneath the pristine public concourses. A system that no modern engineer truly understands. Driven by a sudden, paranoid instinct, I cross-referenced Corin's exact docking timestamp with the station's deep seismic telemetry. I found an anomaly that defied all logic. At the precise second, his yacht clamped onto the magnetic locks of the docking ring. The ancient, supposedly dead core of the Aegis Spindle registered a massive, localized power surge. It was a rhythmic fluctuation. It looked exactly like a heartbeat on the monitors. The station had reacted to him. Or, more accurately, the station had reacted to whatever hidden artifact he had brought aboard. I spent the rest of that night sitting alone in my dimly lit quarters, staring blankly at the scrolling data streams. I was trying desperately to piece together a puzzle whose edges kept bleeding into total darkness. I genuinely thought I was dealing with a spoiled, arrogant aristocrat trying to make some convoluted political statement to impress his mother. I calculated that the worst-case scenario would be Corin throwing a public tantrum at the human cultural exhibit, thereby making the Cerevian Directorate look like petulant, uncultured children on the prime-time galactic broadcast. I was a supreme fool. I exhausted all my mental energy preparing complex damage control strategies for what I assumed would be a minor diplomatic embarrassment. I had absolutely no idea that my cousin was walking the crowded promenades carrying a biological key. I did not realize he was wielding a weaponized trigger, deliberately designed to wake this entire ancient station from its slumber and turn it into an inescapable slaughterhouse. When I looked at Corin, I only worried he would embarrass our noble family. I simply did not know he was walking toward the humans with a catalyst that would ignite a galactic war. To grasp the sheer magnitude of the delusion surrounding the galaxy's current political climate, you must understand the exact lens through which my people view the universe. The Cerevian Directorate is not merely a governing body. It is a meticulously woven tapestry of aristocratic bloodlines, stretching back precisely 12,000 years. We measure our entire societal worth in unbroken lineages, absolute genetic purity, and the flawless execution of ancient, complex rituals. To a high-born Cerevian, true power is not simply possessing the physical capability to destroy an enemy. Power is the absolute, unshakable assurance that you will never need to draw a weapon, because your ancestry demands inherent, unquestioning submission from all lesser beings. We drape our bodies in bioluminescent silks spun from genetically modified arachnids. We modulate our vocal cords to emit exact harmonic frequencies designed to subconsciously trigger psychological compliance in other species. We do not negotiate treaties. We dictate terms from a pedestal of absolute, historical supremacy. In the collective eyes of the High Council, humanity is nothing more than a galactic infant, currently throwing a highly destructive tantrum. They are a profoundly young, unpolished species. They clawed their way out of their planetary gravity well, a mere 3 centuries ago, stumbling blindly into deep space utilizing crude combustion engines, fractured political ideologies, and an alarming propensity for kinetic violence. They are considered useful by the elder races. Certainly. When the border skirmishes erupted 50 years ago, humanity's military infrastructure proved to be aggressively efficient. They pushed back the marauding raider fleets using sheer, brute force logistics and a terrifying willingness to absorb massive casualties to hold a single, tactical position. This brutal effectiveness earned them a temporary place as border wardens, acting as the heavily armed guard dogs of the fringe sectors. But refined, cultured, the elder races view humans as highly trainable attack hounds, barely civilized enough to invite indoors, and certainly not political equals deserving of a permanent seat at the integration summits. My cousin, Corin, was the absolute, walking embodiment of this systemic arrogance. He was a creature sculpted by unyielding privilege and vast generational wealth. Raised in the floating palatial estates of our homeworld, he possessed just enough predatory intelligence to be genuinely dangerous to those around him, but was so utterly insulated from personal consequence that he believed himself physically invincible. He had never faced a single crisis that his mother's money or our family's terrifying influence could not immediately erase from existence. He moved through the galaxy utterly convinced that the universe itself was obligated to yield right-of-way to his surname. He viewed the younger races not as sapient beings with individual rights, but as interactive scenery designed solely for his personal amusement and exploitation. This staggering superiority complex was on full, horrifying display when we descended into the grand concourse for the public cultural exchange fair. The area was a sprawling, exhausting sensory overload. It spanned over 4 square kilometers of neon holographics, thrumming zero-gravity art installations, and the deafening, overlapping chatter of 100 different species, loudly boasting of their technological marvels. Every single delegation was desperately trying to outshine the others, projecting massive, glittering monuments to their own egos. Tucked away in Sector 4, deliberately avoiding the main arteries of foot traffic, the human delegation had claimed a highly modest, dimly lit space. They had not built a towering monument to their military conquests or a flashy, immersive holographic display of their homeworld's economic prosperity. Instead, they had constructed a quiet, almost aggressively somber memorial. It was dedicated to the Arlington Dawn. That was a massive human colony ship that had vanished without a single trace over 80 years ago, carrying exactly 15,000 human souls into the absolute dark of an uncharted sector. The exhibition consisted of a few recovered physical fragments of charred hull plating, suspended silently in localized anti-gravity fields. Surrounding these twisted, burned pieces of metal were small, illuminated glass vials containing physical soil collected from Earth and several of their oldest, harshest frontier colonies. It was a stark, brutal reminder of the void's unforgiving nature, sitting in jarring, almost disrespectful contrast to the celebratory, colorful noise of the surrounding alien booths. It felt exactly like a quiet funeral occurring in the middle of a garish carnival. Standing guard beside this memorial was the human security liaison. Her public data pad designated her as Gunnery Sergeant Alara Vance. She was a United States Marine. She was remarkably tall, even by Cerevian standards, clad in a crisp, charcoal gray dress uniform that seemed designed entirely for strict tactical utility rather than aesthetic dominance. There was no gleaming ceremonial armor, no sweeping capes, no ostentatious badges of rank beyond the simple, matte black chevrons pinned to her collar. Most security forces from the younger, less secure races constantly try to look intimidating to mask their diplomatic anxieties. They puff out their chests, bare their teeth, and rest their hands aggressively on their holstered kinetic weapons. They project an artificial, noisy, and ultimately hollow menace. Sergeant Vance did absolutely none of those things. She stood with her bare hands clasped loosely behind her back. She was utterly, completely still. It was not the rigid, forced stillness of a palace guard holding a ceremonial pose for passing tourists. It was the terrifying, deeply relaxed stillness of a perfectly coiled spring. Her eyes, a cold, piercing shade of pale blue, scanned the passing alien crowds with relentless, mechanical precision. She wasted absolutely no biological energy. Every micro-expression, every subtle shift of her weight was calculated, optimized, and tightly controlled. I noticed faint, silver subdermal wiring tracing the sharp line of her jaw, hinting at extensive, military-grade cybernetic integration beneath her skin. To an untrained, arrogant observer like Corin, she might have looked like a bored, easily ignorable lower-class sentry, but my species evolved directly from apex predators. Long before we built floating palaces and drafted legal treaties, we stalked living prey in the high canopy forests of Cerevia. Deep within my oldest genetic memory, I instantly recognized the terrifying stillness of a master hunter. That absolute disciplined calm, radiating from the human, did not make me feel secure. It made the fine hairs on the back of my neck stand at absolute attention. It made my skin crawl with an intense, primal unease. Corin, naturally blinded by his own systemic prejudice, saw only a target for his public derision. He stood exactly 3 paces away from the memorial boundary, sneering openly at the modest display and the silent Marine guarding it. "Look at them. Lyrax," he whispered, his voice dripping with aristocratic venom, deliberately modulating his tone to ensure his words carried just far enough for the surrounding neutral dignitaries to hear clearly. "They bring their pathetic, minor tragedies to a grand celebration of galactic unity. They truly believe a pile of dirty dirt and broken, worthless metal earns them a permanent seat at the High Council. They are nothing but murderous beasts in uniform, desperately pretending they understand the nuances of high civilization." I firmly ignored his petty cruelty, my attention suddenly and entirely caught by a highly specific detail. Corin was wearing ceremonial gloves, woven from black hypersilk. This was a standard, expected accessory for a noble of his high rank attending a public function. But as he flexed his right hand, a complex geometric pattern briefly illuminated across the palm and knuckles. It was a dense, microscopic bioresonant weave, glowing with a sickly, iridescent amber light. I am a senior master of Cerevian legal and diplomatic protocol. I have spent decades meticulously memorizing the heraldry, the technological augmentations, and the specific ceremonial attire of over 200 major and minor noble houses. I know every single legally authorized symbol within the entire directorate. That specific glowing pattern did not exist in any of our official, heavily guarded registries. It was not a hidden crest of House Thale. It was something entirely foreign, pulsing with a faint, rhythmic energy that seemed to hum at a bizarre frequency that made my teeth ache. A sudden, suffocating wave of dread washed over me. Corin was reckless, but he was rarely inventive. He did not tinker with unauthorized, highly illegal biotechnology unless someone infinitely more dangerous and calculating had personally handed it to him. This was absolutely not a fashion statement. I stepped closer to him, invading his personal space, keeping my voice dangerously low so the passing diplomats and the hovering, intrusive press drones could not overhear my rising panic. "Corin," I hissed, grabbing his left forearm tightly. "What exactly are you wearing on your right hand? That is not standard court attire. I know every sanctioned tech weave in our empire. What is that thing? And what exactly are you planning to do here?" He casually brushed my hand away as if I were a bothersome insect. He did not even look at me. His eyes remained locked entirely on Sergeant Vance. A cruel, highly anticipatory gleam sharpening his aristocratic features. He slowly adjusted the cuff of his silk tunic, smoothing the dark fabric with deliberate, theatrical care. The strange amber light pulsed once more beneath the glove, sinking with a heavy rhythm I could not comprehend. He offered a slow, chilling smile that did not reach his eyes. "I will teach them their true place before the entire station." The central commercial sector of the Aegis spindle was suffocating. Over 12 distinct species crammed into the Grand Promenade, their bodies pressing together beneath the blinding glare of overhead arc lamps. The air hung heavy with a chaotic, unbreathable mix of synthesized pheromones, ionized ozone, and the sharp scent of exotic spices burning in merchant braziers. Hovering just above the dense crowd, dozens of automated press drones darted back and forth like silver insects. Their red recording lenses blinked incessantly, capturing every micro-interaction of the diplomatic summit for trillions of viewers across the galaxy. The ambient noise was not just loud. It was a physical, crushing weight against my eardrums. Amidst this relentless sensory assault, Gunnery Sergeant Alara Vance operated like a perfectly calibrated precision instrument. She did not raise her voice. She did not display a single flicker of physical or mental exhaustion. From my vantage point a few paces away, I watched her carefully guide a cluster of juvenile Kalanites away from the memorial's localized gravity field. The small, scaled creatures were naturally chaotic, darting around and chirping at deafening, high-pitched frequencies. A standard Cerevian station guard would have immediately drawn a stun prod to enforce a 10-meter perimeter. Vance simply knelt. She dropped smoothly to their eye level, pointing calmly to the suspended, burned fragments of the Arlington Dawn, and spoke in a low, even tone. The alien children instantly quieted, mesmerized by her quiet, unyielding authority. She stood back up, seamlessly transitioning to answer aggressive pricing questions from curious merchants. She directed lost delegates with sharp, efficient hand gestures. She maintained absolute, perfect order around her designated perimeter without ever once projecting hostility. I stood completely frozen, forcing my brain to reevaluate everything I had been rigorously taught since childhood. The High Council broadcasted endless, looping reports of human savagery across all official networks. They actively painted the Terrans as volatile, bloodthirsty barbarians barely capable of spaceflight. Yet, observing this lone Marine operate in a highly stressful environment, I saw a terrifying level of psychological restraint. She was a lethal, kinetic weapon, choosing moment by agonizing moment to act as a diplomatic shield. This was not crudeness. It was immense, terrifying discipline. Corin despised it. He stood right beside me, radiating a toxic, suffocating aura of indignation. His fundamental expectation of reality was simple. He was a Thale. The heavy crowd should have parted before him like water. The lower castes should have immediately lowered their eyes in submission. Instead, he was entirely, utterly ignored. A pair of wealthy Tyrellian traders actually brushed past his expensive, silk-draped shoulder, completely disregarding his aristocratic status, just to ask the human sergeant a mundane question about the glass vials of Earth soil. Corin's jaw clenched so tight, I thought his teeth might shatter. The pale blue veins in his neck bulged against his collar. I saw the amber bioresonant weave on his right glove pulse faster, flashing in perfect synchronization with his rapidly accelerating heart rate. His vast vanity was not merely bruised, it was violently, unforgivably insulted. A highborn Cerevian does not tolerate public irrelevance. He moved forward. He did not stroll. He marched with pure, predatory intent. I tried to grab his arm again, to anchor him, but he shook my grip off violently. He stepped directly onto the invisible boundary line of the human exhibit. The hovering press drones instantly sensed the sudden shift in kinetic aggression. 3 of them pivoted in unison, their mechanical lenses zooming in, ready to broadcast the brewing confrontation live across the entire station grid. "Marine!" Corin snapped. His voice was heavily laced with an engineered harmonic frequency, specifically designed by our ancestors to demand biological subservience from lesser prey. "You are obstructing the concourse," Vance turned. She did not snap to rigid attention. She simply shifted her stance, pivoting her hips and placing herself squarely between Corin and the solemn memorial. Her pale blue eyes locked directly onto his face. "This designated area falls within the approved parameters of the cultural exchange." "Sir," she replied. Her voice was entirely flat. There was no rising anger. There was no underlying fear. It was just pure, unyielding protocol delivered at a steady volume. "Your parameters are an inconvenience to your betters," Corin sneered, taking another aggressive step closer. He was now well within her immediate strike zone. "You are blocking the priority traffic flow. Dismantle this pathetic pile of debris and move your station back 5 meters. Now." It was a pathetic, transparently manufactured excuse. The Grand Promenade was over 60 meters wide. The human booth was tucked neatly into a recessed architectural alcove. They were blocking absolutely nothing. "I cannot comply with that request, sir," Vance said. Her hands remained loosely clasped behind her back. "If you have a grievance regarding sector allocation, you must file a formal complaint with the Summit Administrative Office on Level 4. She was textbook perfect. She offered him no emotional bait. She gave him absolutely no legal justification to escalate the encounter. That stoicism only infuriated Corin more. He desperately wanted fear. He wanted her to cower or scream. He was receiving the emotional equivalent of a reinforced titanium wall. "A formal complaint," Corin laughed. It was a harsh, grating sound that echoed sharply over the ambient noise of the crowd. He deliberately raised his voice, ensuring the gathering spectators and the hovering drones caught every single syllable. "You speak of administration as if your primitive kind understands the mechanics of civilized law. You are a footnote in the galactic registry. Your entire recorded history is barely a fraction of my family's noble lineage." The massive crowd began to hush. The chaotic noise of the promenade rapidly dialed down to a tense, highly electric murmur. Spectators stopped walking. The Tyrellian traders backed away slowly, their hands raised in caution. Everyone present recognized the razor edge of an impending diplomatic disaster. Vance remained utterly silent. She just watched his hands. I noticed her eyes, flicking rapidly, tracking the glowing amber pattern pulsing on his silk glove. "You dress yourselves up in these rigid, depressing little uniforms," Corin continued, stepping even closer. The physical distance between them was now less than half a meter. He was invading her space, towering over her. "You parade around this station pretending you are our equals. But we all know what you truly are beneath the fabric. You are hired thugs. You are disposable meat shields for the border worlds. Your species is only fit to serve as mercenaries for the true, architect races of this galaxy. You build absolutely nothing. You only destroy... My breath caught painfully in my throat. The temperature in my veins plummeted to absolute zero. Mercenaries for the true architect races. That was not standard, everyday aristocratic snobbery. Those exact words were highly specific. They were the core, foundational manifesto of the Hollow Mandate. The Mandate was a radical, violently xenophobic terror faction, operating in the deep, untraceable shadows of Cerevian politics. They fundamentally believed the elder races were being poisoned and diluted by the integration of younger, supposedly inferior species. They demanded a brutal return to absolute Cerevian supremacy, utilizing any violent means necessary. I had read their seized manifests in highly classified security briefings just 2 months prior. Corin was not just a spoiled child throwing an impromptu public tantrum to soothe his bruised ego. He had been radicalized. He was an active, weaponized operative. I took a desperate step forward, my mind screaming at me to intervene, to shout for the station security grid to drop containment fields and isolate him immediately. But the dense physical weight of the paralyzed crowd and the sheer, paralyzing shock of the sudden revelation locked my legs in place. I was a fraction of a second too late. Corin turned his head slightly toward me. He did not look at me directly, keeping his focus forward, but he angled his jaw just enough so only I could hear his next words over the ambient, humming silence of the frozen concourse. His eyes were wide, burning with a terrifying, fanatical fever that stripped away the last of his aristocratic veneer. "Watch closely, Lyrax," he whispered, his voice trembling with a dark, terrifying euphoria. "It only takes one strike on the right target, and the whole council will burn." He turned his full, venomous attention back to the silent Marine. He raised his right hand high into the air. The amber bioresonant weave on his hyper-silk glove flared with a sudden, blinding intensity. The heavy air between them seemed to physically warp and hum with raw, unnatural energy. The silver press drones descended like starving vultures, their red eyes unblinking, recording every microsecond. The tension finally snapped. The sound was a sharp, dry crack that severed the heavy atmosphere of the Grand Promenade clean in half. It was an appalling, distinctly biological noise, echoing against the high vaulted ceilings of the commercial sector. Corin's palm, wrapped tightly in that bizarrely glowing hypersilk, struck Gunnery Sergeant Alara Vance directly across her left cheek. The physical force was substantial, driven by the augmented muscle density inherent to our highborn caste. It happened right there, directly in front of the unblinking, mechanical lenses of a dozen automated press drones. It occurred completely exposed to the massive, multi-species crowd, merely 2 paces away from the solemn, illuminated dirt of the human memorial. The immediate aftermath was not a chaotic frenzy. It was a suffocating, absolute vacuum of sound. The overlapping, deafening chatter of 1,000 merchants, diplomats, and tourists died instantly. The hovering Kalenite children froze in midair, their high-pitched chirping abruptly silenced. Even the constant, ambient hum of the commercial sector's massive ventilation systems seemed to vanish from auditory perception. Every single entity in that sprawling sector stopped breathing simultaneously. We were all trapped in a suspended moment of pure, unadulterated shock. We were watching a Cerevian aristocrat physically assault an armed representative of a species known primarily across the galaxy for their terrifying capacity for total war. The kinetic impact had snapped Vance's head sharply to the side. For one long, agonizing second, she remained perfectly still in that awkward, struck posture. Then, she moved. She did not recoil in pain. She did not shout in indignation. She did not erupt into the violent, bloodthirsty frenzy the High Council propaganda constantly promised. Instead, she turned her head back to face my cousin with a slowness that defied all natural instinct. Her pale blue eyes locked directly onto his face. The temperature in the immediate vicinity seemed to physically plummet. The quiet, disciplined soldier, vanished entirely. In her place stood something profoundly cold, utterly detached, and infinitely more terrifying. She was no longer a diplomat. She was evaluating a hostile target. Precisely at that agonizing moment, a microscopic tactical projection flared to life directly over her right temple. It was a subdermal combat interface, projecting a harsh, glowing amber schematic directly across her field of vision. The warning light reflected sharply off her iris. I could not read the rapid human military cipher scrolling across the tiny display, but the urgency of the flashing color was a universal language. The highly advanced biometric sensors embedded in her skin had registered the exact nature of the physical contact. Corin had not merely slapped her to inflict an insult. The highly illegal bioresonant weave on his glove had deposited a foreign, highly complex activator compound directly onto her exposed epidermis. A biological payload had been successfully delivered. Vance's jaw tightened infinitesimally. She spoke exactly one sentence. It was not a threat born of rising anger. It was a cold, procedural declaration of an irreversible threshold being crossed, broadcast loud enough for anyone understanding tactical engagement rules to realize the absolute limit had been breached. Hostile biokinetic transmission detected. Lethal countermeasures authorized. The violence that followed was not a messy, emotional brawl. It was an execution of pure, devastating physics. It lasted exactly 3.04 seconds, from the moment her chilling warning ended to the moment his biological functions ceased entirely. In the first fraction of a second, Vance completely abandoned her rigid, defensive posture. She dropped her center of gravity drastically, slipping entirely under Corin's line of sight and completely shattering his arrogant, upright stance. He was tall, heavily built, and culturally conditioned to expect submission. His balance was perfectly designed for grand ballroom floors and elevated podiums. Absolutely not for a lethal, close-quarters kinetic engagement. At the 1-second mark, she stepped aggressively inside his personal guard. The movement was an impossible blur of dark gray uniform fabric. She did not even attempt to draw her holstered sidearm. She simply did not need to waste the time. Her left hand shot upward, an open palm strike connecting with devastating, calculated precision against the inside of his right elbow joint. There was a sickening, wet snap that echoed loudly in the silent plaza. Corin's arm bent entirely backward against its natural joint, instantly neutralizing the hand wearing the glowing, venomous glove. He did not even possess the neurological processing speed to register the agony before the next strike landed. Moving, with terrifying kinetic efficiency, Vance pivoted her hips sharply, channeling the entire momentum of her heavy frame into her right arm. At the 2-second mark, she delivered a single, heavily concentrated strike to the primary neurovascular cluster, located exactly at the base of his long, aristocratic neck. It was a highly specific, fatal vulnerability in Cerevian anatomy. It was a pressure point guarded by thick layers of cultural taboo, but it was entirely exposed to a predator specifically trained to dismantle hostile biological systems. The kinetic impact scrambled his central nervous system instantly, the electrical signals keeping his heart beating and his lungs drawing breath were violently, permanently severed. At exactly 3.04 seconds, Corin Thale's eyes rolled back deeply into his skull. The arrogant sneer vanished forever, quickly replaced by the slack, empty expression of a completely disconnected machine. He collapsed onto the cold, heavily reinforced metal deck plating of the concourse, like a lavishly dressed puppet, with its heavy strings cut abruptly. He was clinically dead before his expensive silk-draped shoulders even hit the ground. The automated emergency protocols of the Aegis spindle finally registered the catastrophic, sudden drop in his vital signs. 2 sleek, white medical drones detached violently from the ceiling grid and plummeted toward us, their sirens wailing a desperate, high-pitched alarm. But their arrival was entirely futile. They hovered helplessly over his crumpled form, projecting frantic, useless scanning lasers over a body that had already permanently crossed the ultimate biological threshold. The great heir to House Thale, the arrogant prince who sought to teach the galaxy a brutal lesson, was reduced to a lifeless obstacle bleeding onto the floor. Yet, my immediate, paralyzing horror was not directed at the fresh corpse of my cousin. At the exact millisecond, Corin's heavy body hit the metal floor. A sensation entirely separate from the sudden violence washed over me. It started deep in the soles of my boots. A deep, sub-audible vibration shuddered violently through the heavy, reinforced plating of the Grand Promenade. It was not the mechanical, steady hum of the station's environmental regulators, or the distant, roaring thrusters of massive passing cargo ships. It was a profound, terrifying tectonic shift. It felt exactly as though a colossal, ancient beast buried kilometers beneath our feet had just drawn a sudden, jagged breath. The massive holographic advertising banners above us flickered and distorted violently for one terrifying microsecond. The ancient, unfathomable core of the Aegis spindle was waking up. It had received the exact signal Corin had just delivered. Gunnery Sergeant Alara Vance did not spare a single, triumphant glance down at the body at her feet. The immediate kinetic threat was fully neutralized, and therefore, it was completely irrelevant to her current operational parameters. She instantly tapped a recessed, matte black comms unit, perfectly integrated into her collar. Her voice rang out over the stunned, paralyzed crowd, slicing sharply through the rising panic with absolute, chilling military authority. "Execute Emergency Protocol Echo Vanguard," she commanded flawlessly. "Seal all heavy blast doors in Sector 4 immediately. Nobody enters or leaves this quadrant." She raised her head slowly. Her pale blue eyes scanned the massive, terrified crowd with mechanical precision before locking directly onto my face. Her next words froze the blood running through my veins completely. "He did not just touch me. He just tried to activate something." The digital shockwave outpaced the physical lockdown by several magnitudes. Within 5 minutes of the heavy blast doors sealing Sector 4, the raw, unedited footage was everywhere. Spliced, looped, and aggressively filtered. The recording, titled "Alien Slapped a United States Marine," saturated every local data grid and began broadcasting across the deep space communication buoys. It mutated instantly from a localized incident into a sprawling, volatile intergalactic scandal. Outrage from my own people was immediate and deafening. The Cerevian diplomatic channels flooded the station's central arbitration network with maximum priority mandates. The High Commissioner of our delegation openly screamed through the holographic projectors, demanding Gunnery Sergeant Vance be handed over in heavy kinetic chains. They branded the lightning-fast defensive maneuver a calculated, brutal public execution. They demanded blood for blood, invoking ancient treaties that had not been dusted off in 2 centuries. I found myself isolated inside the rapidly established human security perimeter. Given my status as a senior adjudicator and my direct blood relation to the deceased, they could not legally expel me without triggering an even worse jurisdictional crisis. I sat in a modular tactical tent erected right in the middle of the lockdown concourse, expecting to see the Terran soldiers exchanging victorious glances or bracing for a brutal firefight. Instead, I witnessed a terrifying, icy efficiency. The humans were not gloating. They were not even looking at the heavy, sealed doors where local station security was futilely demanding entry. The entire human detachment was operating under a condition of absolute, silent dread. Their attention was completely diverted from the political firestorm raging outside. They were entirely focused on a sterile, portable containment unit resting on a metallic table. Inside that reinforced glass box was Corin's severed right glove. They treated the fabric not as evidence of an assault, but as a live, highly unstable munitions payload. Major Thomas Hayes, the lead intelligence officer for the terrestrial delegation, invited me into the mobile forensic lab a short while later. The air inside smelled sharply of ozone and harsh chemical scrubbers. A team of xenobiologists and cyber warfare specialists were crowded around holographic diagnostic tables, their faces illuminated by streams of complex data. "We are not holding you here as a prisoner, Adjudicator Thale," Hayes stated, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that betrayed profound exhaustion. "We are keeping you inside the blast shields because you are the only Cerevian on this station who might actually understand the scale of what your cousin just attempted to do." He gestured toward a magnified projection of the hyper-silk glove. The ambient amber glow I had noticed earlier was gone, replaced by a harsh, diagnostic white light illuminating the microscopic weave. "Our initial scans detected unauthorized bioresonance," Hayes explained, his finger tracing a dense, crystalline cluster woven directly into the palm of the fabric. "It is not a poison. It is not a localized kinetic amplifier. Our deep-core forensic analysts identified it as a quorum seed. It is a quantum biological lock, heavily encrypted and incredibly unstable." I stared at the projection, my mind racing through the vast archives of Cerevian legal tech. A quorum seed was theoretical. It was a mythological piece of precursor technology, rumored to require a perfect synchronization of genetic material, immense kinetic force, and a direct physical connection to a primary architecture to initiate a system override. "The physical strike was not the primary objective," Hayes continued, confirming my most terrifying suspicions. "Your cousin did not want to simply humiliate our Marine. The slap was a required delivery mechanism. It was a biometric detonator. The quorum seed was specifically engineered to transfer a massive, compressed data payload into the Aegis Spindle's subterranean core network. But the seed needed a biological conduit to bridge the gap between the glove and the station's atmospheric grounding matrix. It needed a living host to act as a conductive wire. The realization hit me with the physical force of a heavy cruiser crashing into a moon. Corin had deliberately targeted Sergeant Vance because her heavy combat boots were magnetically tethered to the deck plating for crowd control stability, providing a flawless, uninterrupted circuit directly down to the ancient superstructure. The insult was entirely manufactured. The entire confrontation was a meticulously designed engineering puzzle, disguised as an aristocratic temper tantrum. "Why did it fail?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, terrified of the answer. "If the payload was delivered, why is the station still intact?" A female technician standing beside Hayes looked up from her terminal. "Sergeant Vance is heavily augmented," she replied crisply. "Her subdermal combat implants include an aggressive biochemical filtration system designed to isolate and purge foreign neurological agents. In the exact moment of physical contact, her internal sensors recognized the quantum intrusion. Her nervous system effectively firewalled the data transfer. She severed the biological connection by neutralizing the threat before the upload could complete." The technician brought up a secondary screen, displaying a terrifying countdown timer that had been frozen at a mere 7 seconds. "Even with the physical connection severed," the technician added grimly, "a fragmented packet of the wake-up key bled into the local network. Our cyber defense teams fought a brutal, invisible war in the digital dark, while the rest of the station was screaming about a murder. If our counter-intrusion software had been 7 seconds slower in isolating that corrupted code, the primary seal bays of this entire sector would have opened simultaneously. The station's ancient defense grid was preparing to violently vent all oxygen into the void." I gripped the edge of the metal table to keep my legs from giving out. The gravity of the situation was crushing. My cousin, the spoiled, arrogant noble who I thought was merely seeking a petty thrill, was actually a willing, weaponized pawn. He had been pushed onto the most public stage possible to initiate a catastrophic, localized genocide. And whoever handed him that glove knew exactly what the consequences would be. They needed a spectacular crisis. They needed a justification for total war. A harsh tone chimed from my encrypted personal data pad, shattering the tense silence of the lab. It was a maximum security alert from the Cerevian diplomatic matrix, a channel restricted entirely to the absolute highest echelons of our governing families. The encryption key belonged to matriarch Oressa Thale. I isolated the audio feed and pressed the earpiece tightly against my head, expecting to hear the devastated, furious wails of a mother who had just watched her only son die on a live galactic broadcast. I braced myself for threats of vengeance and demands for orbital bombardment. Instead, the audio file contained no tears. There was no grief. There was only the cold, mechanical hum of a heavily shielded transmission room and a voice as sharp and unforgiving as shattered obsidian. "This is a priority directive to all embedded operatives on the Aegis spindle," Oressa's voice commanded, completely devoid of any maternal emotion. "The primary vessel has been neutralized. The deployment was interrupted. Shift all tactical resources to secondary objectives immediately. Find the Terran soldier. Recover the seed at all costs." She did not care that Corin was lying on a slab. She did not care about the diplomatic fallout. The matriarch of House Thale was only concerned about retrieving the detonator her son had failed to trigger. The murder of my cousin was nothing more than a discarded shell casing. The real war was already burning in the shadows, and we were all trapped inside the blast radius. I was escorted out of the forensic tent and led deeper into the temporary terrestrial stronghold. The heavy blast doors of Sector 4 remained firmly sealed behind us, holding back the mounting fury of the Cerevian delegation. The Marines flanking me moved in absolute, synchronized silence. They guided me into a repurposed maintenance bay that had been aggressively retrofitted into a highly secure, electromagnetically shielded command center. Waiting inside were two individuals who completely shattered my preconceived notions of human leadership. Admiral Jonah Pike stood near a massive holographic tactical table. He was a man carved from weathered granite, his uniform immaculate, but devoid of the absurd, glittering medals our own fleet commanders insisted upon wearing. Beside him sat Ambassador Simone Hartwell, a woman whose calm, calculating demeanor radiated an intelligence sharper than any physical blade. There were no diplomatic pleasantries. They did not offer me a seat. "Adjudicator Thale," Ambassador Hartwell began, her voice smooth, but carrying the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. "The Directorate believes we are naive. Your High Council operates under the assumption that humanity stumbled into the deep black blind, relying solely on kinetic brute force to secure our borders. They think we are children playing in an ancient sandbox." She tapped a command onto the glass surface of the table. The room darkened. A complex, three-dimensional schematic of the Aegis spindle materialized between us. But it was entirely wrong. It lacked the sprawling commercial promenades, the luxurious diplomatic spires, and the endless cargo bays I knew so well. Instead, the projection displayed the hidden, subterranean architecture of the installation. I saw rows of colossal, dormant energy conduits. I saw heavily armored firing silos disguised as sensor arrays. I saw a massive, central power core that looked less like a reactor and more like the beating heart of a synthetic leviathan. "This is not a neutral transit hub," Admiral Pike stated flatly, crossing his thick arms. "It never was. You Cerevians claimed this sector 1,000 years ago, built your fancy markets over the existing superstructure, and declared it a marvel of your own engineering. But our deep space archaeological teams have been quietly studying precursor ruins along the frontier for 5 decades. We recognized the structural signature the moment we arrived." Pike leaned over the projection, his eyes locking onto mine. "The Aegis spindle is a planetary siege engine. It is a disguised, fully automated orbital fortress left behind by a civilization that wiped itself out long before your ancestors even learned to forge metal." My breath caught. I stared at the terrifying schematic. The sheer scale of the weaponized infrastructure hidden beneath our feet was staggering. We decoded a fragment of the precursor warning beacons scattered in the neighboring dead sectors. Ambassador Hartwell continued, her tone conversational but devastating. The translations were fragmented, but the core directive was crystal clear. The fortress enters an irreversible, active combat state when a highly specific biological signature connects with its primary command matrix. They called it the sovereign bloodline. Hartwell swiped her hand, and the projection shifted. It displayed a complex, spiraling double helix of genetic code. My heart pounded against my ribs as I recognized the familiar, proprietary markers of Cerevian highborn DNA. But it was not just any highborn signature. We did not join the galactic intelligence game yesterday. Adjudicator, Pike said, a grim shadow of a smile touching the corners of his mouth. While your council was busy debating our cultural refinement, human intelligence agencies were quietly cataloging the genetic profiles of every major ruling family in the Alliance. We were looking for matches to the precursor sequences. We found one. The genetic helix on the table, fractured, highlighting a highly specific, rare mutation sequence. The sovereign bloodline, Hartwell said softly. It is an almost perfect match for the ancestral lineage of House Thale. You and your cousin carry the biological key to arming this station. The floor beneath me felt as though it was disintegrating. The Hollow Mandate had not chosen Corrin merely because he was a foolish, disposable radical. They had chosen him because his very blood was the detonator required to weaponize the Aegis spindle. That is why he targeted the human exhibit, I whispered, the terrifying puzzle finally assembling itself in my mind. Exactly, Pike confirmed, his voice hardening into cold steel. Did you really think we requested that specific alcove in Sector 4 to display dirt and broken metal out of pure sentimentality? We are not that terribly romantic. Adjudicator. He zoomed the schematic into the exact location of the human memorial. Deep beneath the floor plating where Sergeant Vance had been standing, a massive, dormant data node pulsed with a faint, simulated red light. That alcove sits directly above a primary, unshielded lock node of the fortress core, Pike explained. It is one of the very few access points where a physical biological transfer could bypass the heavy shielding. We knew this. We requested the space under the guise of cultural exchange, heavily reinforced the subflooring, and stationed our most heavily augmented counterintelligence marine directly on top of the trigger. I looked from the Admiral to the Ambassador in sheer, unadulterated shock. The narrative pushed by the High Council was that humans were reactive, impulsive brutes. Yet here they were, demonstrating a level of proactive, terrifyingly calculated paranoia that shamed our oldest intelligence networks. They had walked onto an ancient, dormant bomb, fully aware of its nature, and quietly placed their boot squarely on the firing pin before anyone else even realized the bomb existed. If your cousin had completed that upload, Hartwell said, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper, the Aegis spindle would have immediately initiated a total lockdown. It would have clamped heavy magnetic tethers onto every single fleet currently docked in the port. It would have deployed a localized dampening field, instantly neutralizing all faster-than-light communications. We would be completely blind and deaf. Pike finished the grim scenario. Then, the automated defense grid would have designated targets. Judging by the xenophobic nature of the Hollow Mandate, the station would likely have vaporized the terrestrial delegation first, followed by any allied fleets, before turning its guns on the planetary colonies below. Millions dead in the opening barrage. A galactic war manufactured in seconds. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. I realized then that I was not looking at a primitive species desperately trying to prove their worth. I was looking at apex survivors. We do not want a war, Lyrax, Admiral Pike said, using my first name, dropping the formal titles. His expression was a mixture of deep fatigue and unyielding resolve. Humanity has bled enough in our own history. We came to this summit in good faith to build a bridge. But we are absolutely not foolish enough to stand on an ancient weapon without mapping the trigger. And we certainly will not allow radicalized aristocrats to dictate our survival. I finally understood the true, terrifying essence of the human spirit. Their strength was not merely their ability to fight back fiercely when cornered. Their true power was their cold, unflinching willingness to look into the abyss, anticipate the absolute worst-case scenario, and prepare a lethal countermeasure while everyone else was busy arguing over banquet seating arrangements. They were not the wild dogs of the galaxy. They were the wolves who had quietly memorized the layout of the entire sheepfold. The Terrestrial Intelligence Division had completely shattered Corrin's personal encryption within 2 hours of his biological cessation. Major Hayes did not say a word as he handed me a sleek, matte black data tablet. The file open on the illuminated screen was my cousin's private journal, neatly transcribed from his voice recordings into our native Cerevian script. I accepted the device with trembling hands. I had braced my mind to read the deranged, fanatic manifesto of a willing suicide operative. I fully expected to find the dark, poetic ramblings of a terrorist ready to sacrifice his own life for a twisted cause. Instead, the truth I discovered inside those digital pages shattered my heart in a completely different, infinitely more pathetic manner. Corrin never expected to die. He wrote extensively, with agonizing vanity, about the immediate aftermath of the planned confrontation. He had meticulously detailed his anticipated wardrobe changes for the subsequent diplomatic tribunals. He genuinely believed that after he delivered the biometric payload to the station's core, the resulting localized lockdown would simply force a highly controlled, dramatic political crisis. In his mind, the brief terror of the lockdown would provide the perfect stage. House Thale would boldly step forward, publicly demand absolute accountability for the security breach, and ruthlessly bring the human delegation to their knees before the entire High Council. According to his final entries, the architects of this plot had promised him the ultimate prize. Following the incident, he was guaranteed the role of the political vanguard. He wrote gleefully about becoming the young, vibrant, and heroic face of a newly invigorated, hardline movement against Earth. He genuinely thought he was playing a masterful, sophisticated game of interstellar chess. The profound tragedy was that he possessed absolutely no idea he was merely a disposable pawn being maneuvered directly into a lethal, kinetic firing line. As I scrolled deeper into the decrypted archives, the journal entries began to map out a terrifying, sprawling web of internal corruption. The Hollow Mandate was not some isolated fringe cult of extremists hiding in the deep radiation belts of the outer colonies. They were sitting comfortably in the plush, silk-lined chairs of the Cerevian high courts. His logs listed covert meetings, financial transfers, and encrypted communications, proving they had successfully infiltrated over 40% of our upper administrative offices. They were actively, methodically weaponizing the general populace's natural anxiety regarding the new, aggressive human species to systematically hoard centralized power for themselves. Then, a highly specific encrypted routing node caught my eye, freezing the blood in my veins. It was a secure communication protocol I instantly recognized from my own family's historical archives. It belonged to Tarek Vale. Tarek was my older cousin, a brilliant, progressive legal scholar who had served as my early mentor. He had vanished from all public records exactly 4 years ago. The official, heavily broadcasted family narrative stated he had retreated to an isolated monastic colony due to a sudden, highly aggressive neurological illness. Tracing the residual signal logs embedded in Corrin's encrypted diary, I finally uncovered the brutal truth. Tarek had discovered the Mandate's financial ties to our own highborn houses. He had quietly gathered the evidence and attempted to expose them to the central judiciary. He was not sick. He had been quietly, efficiently erased from existence by the very people he called family. But the final, most devastating piece of evidence rested in a deeply buried, recovered transmission fragment. It was a direct communication between Matriarch Oressa and an anonymous mandate handler, sent precisely 12 hours before Corin docked his yacht at the Aegis Spindle. The handler explicitly warned her that deliberately provoking a highly augmented, combat-ready terrestrial marine carried an 85% probability of a lethal kinetic response. The handler advised selecting a softer, less lethal target for the biometric transfer. Oressa's recorded reply was a single, chilling text string. She acknowledged the statistical risk and formally authorized the deployment anyway. She knew her son was a pampered aristocrat, entirely unequipped for actual, physical combat. She knew the human soldier would likely strike him down before he could even blink. A living, deeply arrogant heir who talked too much was a massive political liability. But a brutally murdered son, struck down in his prime by a human savage, was an immaculate, unimpeachable martyr. She had knowingly and deliberately fed her own child to the wolves simply to ignite the fires of a holy war. I am heavily trained to be a creature of pure, objective law. I have spent my entire adult life burying my emotions beneath layers of rigid protocol and diplomatic detachment. But sitting in that cold, utilitarian human bunker, surrounded by the stark reality of my family's profound darkness, the immense weight of the betrayal finally broke my resolve. I dropped the tablet onto the metal desk. I covered my face with my hands, my shoulders shaking violently, as silent, agonizing tears spilled over my fingers. Corin was undeniably guilty of immense cruelty and blinding prejudice. He was a bigot, a bully, and a fool. But in the grand, terrible machinery of our society, he was also a victim. He was a tragic product of a deeply diseased system, carefully molded into a weapon and ultimately slaughtered by the very woman who gave him life. The grand, elegant tapestry of Cerevian nobility, which I had proudly served my entire life, was nothing but a beautiful, glowing shroud covering a rotting, festering wound. Ambassador Hartwell stepped forward, breaking the heavy silence of the room. She placed a warm, surprisingly gentle hand on my shoulder. She did not offer empty platitudes. Instead, she offered me an immediate, highly secure extraction. She outlined a comprehensive plan to smuggle me aboard a heavily cloaked tactical cruiser. She promised me full, irrevocable asylum on a core terrestrial world, guaranteed protection by the entire United States military intelligence apparatus, and a new, completely untraceable identity, complete with a generous lifetime financial stipend. She assured me I would never have to look over my shoulder again. All I had to do was walk away, leave the Aegis Spindle, and let the human fleets handle the impending, catastrophic storm my family had summoned. I sat there for 3 long minutes, staring at the harsh, fluorescent lighting reflecting off the metal table. The offer was a lifeline pulled straight from a drowning nightmare. Slowly, I wiped the cold moisture from my cheeks and stood up, squaring my shoulders. I looked directly into the ambassador's eyes. If I ran, Oressa would win by default. She would stand gracefully before the Alliance Arbitration Council, wearing her immaculate mourning silks, weeping false, highly calculated tears. She would demand the immediate, violent eradication of the human race, and the galaxy would give it to her. My people, billions of innocent Cerevians who knew absolutely nothing of this shadow war, would be forcibly drafted into a meat grinder, thrown against the most terrifyingly efficient military machine in the known universe. I simply could not abandon my entire species to burn in the flames of my aunt's sociopathic ambition. I politely, but firmly declined the ambassador's offer of asylum. I told her I would not be hiding in the dark while my civilization tore itself apart. I informed them that I was going to walk directly into the neutral, highly publicized arbitration hearing scheduled for the following morning. I possessed the legal authority, the necessary access codes, and now, the undeniable proof of high treason. I was going to use the exact, archaic, Unyielding Cerevian laws they held so sacred to utterly and publicly dismantle matriarch Oresa political fortress. It was a reckless, desperate maneuver, carrying a 99% probability of catastrophic, fatal failure for myself. But the alternative was the burning of 1,000 worlds, and I absolutely refused to let my family light the match. The grand arbitration chamber of the Aegis Spindle was a vast amphitheater carved from pale, acoustic stone. It was designed to foster harmony, yet today it felt exactly like a gladiatorial arena. The central podium was illuminated by harsh, unforgiving light, while the viewing galleries were swallowed by deep shadows. The neutral Judiciary Council, comprised of 7 elders from species with no direct stake in the border conflicts, presided over the session. The officially filed mandate was a procedural review to determine the legal justification of Gunnery Sergeant Vance's lethal defensive action. The unspoken reality was that humanity itself was on trial for its right to exist within civilized space. Matriarch Oresa Thala commanded the floor before the first gavel even fell. She did not wear the customary vibrant colors of her highborn status. Instead, she was draped entirely in light-absorbing mourning fabric, a material so profoundly black it seemed to tear a hole in the visual spectrum. She moved with a calculated, fragile grace. When she spoke to the council, her voice trembled with perfectly engineered sorrow. She did not scream for vengeance. She wept for a lost son, portraying Corin as a curious, perhaps overly enthusiastic youth, brutally cut down by an unfeeling military machine. Her performance was an absolute masterpiece of emotional manipulation. I watched the posture of the neutral judges soften. The collective empathy of the massive multi-species gallery tilted dangerously toward her fabricated grief. The anti-Terran faction, operating seamlessly through proxy legal aids, immediately capitalized on this emotional vulnerability. They flooded the chamber's massive holographic displays with heavily spliced, aggressively curated video feeds of the incident. They removed all audio context. They cut the footage of Corin's initial approach and his whispered threats. They exclusively looped the exact fraction of a second where Alara's posture shifted from passive to lethal. They artificially enhanced the cold, calculating geometry of her strike, painting the Marine not as a protector, neutralizing a biological threat, but as a hyper-violent apex predator, executing a helpless aristocrat for a minor slight. They were actively constructing a symbol of human belligerence for the entire galaxy to fear. When I was finally called to the witness stand, the air in the chamber grew incredibly dense. Oresa stared at me with eyes like polished obsidian, silently daring me to break ranks. I played my part with agonizing caution. I answered the Inquisitor's questions with sterile, legally precise confirmations. Yes, my cousin initiated physical contact. Yes, the human responded with lethal kinetic force. I deliberately withheld the revelation of the quorum seed, the weaponized glove, and Tarek's encrypted files. If I played my ultimate hand too early, while the chamber was still intoxicated by Oresa's grief, her legal team would simply bury the evidence under layers of jurisdictional objections and technical dismissals. I needed them arrogant. I needed them to believe I was properly terrified and compliant. A mandatory recess was called at hour 4 of the proceedings. The heavy tension in the room fractured into chaotic murmurs as delegations spilled out into the adjacent security concourses. I remained near the upper observation decks, maintaining a strategic vantage point over the central plaza, where the terrestrial exhibit was still heavily cordoned off. The trap was sprung exactly 12 minutes into the break. It did not come from a Cerevian guard or a diplomatic envoy. 6 heavy-duty maintenance drones, the massive, heavily armored units typically used for exterior hull repair, suddenly plummeted from the vaulted ceiling grid. Their optical sensors, normally a passive green, burned with a hostile, hacked crimson light. They crashed violently into the human memorial zone, their heavy metallic limbs smashing the stasis displays and scattering the vials of Earth soil. Simultaneously, their auditory projectors began blasting a synthesized, deafening audio track. It perfectly mimicked terrestrial combat barks, broadcasting fake orders to open fire, designate targets, and execute hostile aliens. It was a brilliantly cruel false flag operation. The mandate wanted the humans to react to the mechanical threat with overwhelming, indiscriminate kinetic force, right in front of the mingling neutral diplomats. They wanted a bloodbath to validate the video splices shown inside the courtroom. The gallery above the plaza screamed and scrambled for the exits. I gripped the railing, my breath caught in my throat, watching Sergeant Vance and her perimeter squad. They were heavily armed. They had every tactical justification to turn the hijacked drones into molten slag. Instead, Vance barked a command that entirely shattered the mandate's narrative. "Hold fire! Defensive formation Delta! Secure the civilian assets!" The Marines did not raise their heavy rifles toward the rampaging machines. They instantly turned their backs to the threat. Moving with breathtaking synchronization, they formed a living, armored wall between the thrashing drones and the panicking crowd. I watched Vance personally dive across the deck plating to shield a terrified, paralyzed Tyrellian merchant from a piece of shattered shrapnel. She took the heavy kinetic impact squarely on her armored shoulder, grunting in pain, but never once reaching for her sidearm. She directed her squad to funnel the minor dependents of various species toward the heavily shielded transit tubes, prioritizing evacuation and containment over engagement. They absorbed the violence without returning it. The neutral diplomats and independent journalists trapped in the concourse witnessed this terrifying, absolute discipline firsthand. The fabricated image of the bloodthirsty human savage evaporated instantly, replaced by the undeniable reality of soldiers willing to take physical damage to protect alien bystanders. The psychological tide of the entire summit shifted in those frantic 2 minutes. While the station's security forces finally arrived to disable the rogue drones, I utilized the ensuing chaos to vanish from the observation deck. I needed to verify the final piece of Tarek's puzzle. Following the ancient, encrypted routing node from Corrin's journal, I descended deep into the station's forgotten administrative sublevels. The air here was stale, thick with the scent of ozone and decaying polymers. I navigated a labyrinth of dead server banks until I found the specific archival vault Tarek had flagged. The heavy locking mechanism was archaic, but my high-born biometric bypass still possessed the necessary clearance. Inside, the space was cramped and suffocating. I plugged my data tablet into a dusty, isolated terminal and fed it the decryption key I had reconstructed from the journal. The screen flickered to life, revealing Tarek Vale's final master file. It contained the raw, unfiltered telemetry data he had extracted from the Aegis Spindle's subterranean core before they silenced him. I read the scrolling code, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had assumed the failed quorum seed upload was designed to trigger an immediate, localized massacre to influence the initial hearings. But as I translated the precursor command strings, the true, horrifying scale of the mandate's plan crystallized before my eyes. The biological strike was never meant to initiate the fortress's weapons immediately. It was a delayed ignition sequence. The core required a specific calibration period to fully map the energy signatures of the docked fleets and bypass the modern safety inhibitors. I checked the temporal activation parameters Tarek had uncovered. The catastrophic awakening of the ancient siege engine. The moment the station would magnetically lock the port and begin vaporizing vessels, was hard-coded to a very specific future timestamp. I cross-referenced the numbers with the official summit itinerary. My blood ran completely cold. The activation was not scheduled for today. It was perfectly synchronized to execute exactly 14 days from now. That was the precise date the Neutral Council was scheduled to deliver their final, binding verdict. It was the exact day when the absolute maximum number of Alliance dreadnoughts and terrestrial heavy cruisers would be densely packed into the Aegis Spindle's gravity well. Their weapon systems hot, their commanders waiting on a hair trigger for the legal outcome. Matriarch Aressa and the Hollow Mandate were not just trying to win a court case. They had built an inescapable, galactic kill box, and we were all patiently waiting for the doors to lock. The 14th day arrived exactly as the decrypted timeline predicted. Inside the grand arbitration chamber, the tension was thick enough to shatter a diamond. I stood at the prosecution booth, waiting for the presiding judge to strike the final wooden gavel. But the gavel never fell. Instead, the floor completely vanished. It was not a structural collapse. The artificial gravity grid of the Aegis spindle simply inverted for a terrifying 2 seconds, throwing screaming delegates violently into the air before slamming us brutally back down onto the acoustic stone. A sound like grinding tectonic plates echoed through the massive chamber. The soft, ambient white lighting of the room died instantly, replaced by a harsh, pulsating amber glow that bathed everyone in the color of ancient rust. My encrypted comms unit screamed. Major Hayes's voice cut through the heavy static, completely abandoning his usual operational calm. An embedded mole within the Alliance security detachment had breached the terrestrial forensic tent during the night. The severed hand and the hypersilk glove were gone. The infiltrator had slammed the corrupted biometric weave directly onto a secondary, heavily concealed access node in the lower maintenance tiers. The delayed upload was completely bypassed. The quorum seed had fully germinated. The Aegis spindle was awake. Deep beneath us, corridors that had been hermetically sealed for thousands of years groaned open, venting ancient, stale air into the pristine modern promenades. Above the station, the massive decorative structural fins began to retract violently. In their place, colossal, black metal precursor artillery batteries, deployed from hidden silos, swiveling with terrifying mechanical speed to paint target locks across the heavily congested docking rings. Matriarch Aressa did not even flinch at the violent tremors rocking the chamber. She stood tall amidst the panicking, bleeding diplomats, her mourning silks immaculate, and pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at the terrestrial delegation. Her voice, amplified by her own hidden bioacoustics, dominated the chaos. She screamed that the humans were intentionally detonating the station's core in a desperate act of spite. She demanded the Neutral Council instantly authorize a preemptive orbital strike to neutralize the terrestrial ships before they could escape the blast radius. Outside the massive crystalline viewports, I could clearly see the Cerevian dreadnoughts charging their primary plasma lances, aiming directly at the heavily outnumbered human heavy cruisers. The trap was closing perfectly. I could not wait for legal procedure. I forcefully connected my data tablet to the chamber's central public address system and flooded the massive holographic projectors with Tarek's decrypted files. I displayed the Hollow Mandate's financial ledgers, the coded communication logs, and the exact countdown timer I had discovered in the deep archives. I shouted over the blaring sirens, exposing the entire manufactured crisis to the panicked council. But Aressa was a terrifying master of the political dark arts. She feigned absolute, horrified shock. She looked at the evidence and smoothly pivoted her entire narrative without missing a single beat. She claimed the files were obvious, desperate human forgeries designed to frame her noble family for their own barbaric terrorism. She vehemently denied any direct link to the anonymous mandate handlers. The neutral judges, panicked and staring at a literal apocalypse unfolding outside the windows, hesitated. A legal stalemate in a burning room is an absolute death sentence. We had mere minutes before the automated defenses fired and the fleets annihilated each other in a blinding crossfire. Then, the heavy oak doors of the chamber shattered inward. Gunnery Sergeant Alara Vance stepped through the splintered debris, her gray combat armor scorched and sparking from the failing energy grids outside. She did not address the screaming council. She marched directly to my position. She explained rapidly that the station's internal security matrix had activated lethal radiation fields across all the lower levels, instantly incinerating anyone trying to reach the core. The infiltrator who completed the upload was already dead, burned to ash by the precursor defenses the second the transfer finished. The manual override was physically unreachable. However, her military medical telemetry from the initial attack showed a critical, impossible anomaly. When her cybernetic implants firewalled Corin's biological upload 14 days ago, a microscopic fragment of the quorum seed's quantum signature became permanently embedded within her own nervous system. She carried the incomplete ghost print of the activation key in her blood. The ancient security matrix would register her, not as a hostile biological intruder, but as a damaged, authorized component of the firing mechanism. She could walk through the radiation fields completely unharmed, but there was a fatal catch. She could survive the descent, but she could absolutely not input the final abort sequence. The absolute core command interface required a living, pulsing sample of the sovereign bloodline to accept a total shutdown override. She needed a Thale to turn the key. I did not hesitate for a single second. I stripped off my heavy, restrictive adjudicator robes, leaving only my fitted undertunic, and ran alongside the United States Marine. We plunged into the howling labyrinth of the spindle. The journey was a kinetic nightmare of shifting gravity planes and strobing amber lights. We bypassed piles of vaporized security drones and melted blast doors. True to her medical data, as we crossed the threshold of the primary core descent shaft, the lethal energy fields simply parted around Alara's body, extending a narrow, shifting corridor of safety that I desperately clung to, matching her relentless pace perfectly. We breached the central command matrix. It was a cavernous, spherical chamber, dominated by a monolithic, floating console made of liquid black glass. Outside, the tactical link in Alara's helmet warned us that the opposing fleets were exactly 40 seconds away from exchanging a mutual, galaxy-ending volley. Alara slammed her bare hand onto the liquid glass, establishing the initial biological handshake, while I drew a sharp ceremonial blade from my boot, sliced my palm open, and pressed my bleeding hand directly beside hers. The ancient artificial intelligence roared to life. Blinding holographic runes spun wildly around us in a dizzying cyclone of light. I braced my body for total rejection, fully expecting the system to incinerate us both for tampering with its awakening cycle. Instead, the system accepted my bloodline. It verified Alara's biometric ghost print. But it was the translation text scrolling across the central display that made my breath catch painfully in my throat. The precursor artificial intelligence had not viewed Corin as its rightful master. As it processed our shutdown request, it pulled up the security logs from the Grand Promenade exactly 14 days prior. The text flashed in bold, archaic, Cerevian syntax for both of us to read. It explicitly classified the sudden biological termination of the primary conduit by Gunnery Sergeant Vance. It did not register her kinetic strike as an assassination. The ancient war machine formally marked her lethal action as a completely valid, sanctioned intervention to prevent an unauthorized, premature system catastrophe. The station did not see the Marine as a murderer. It recognized her as its own, brilliantly efficient, temporary immune system. The spherical command matrix pulsed with an overwhelming, cold intelligence. As our blood mingled on the liquid black glass of the central console, the ancient artificial intelligence did not merely process our biometric signatures. It unfolded the buried history of my own ancestors directly into my mind. I saw centuries of secret archaeological expeditions funded by House Thale. I saw generations of my family meticulously breeding for the exact genetic markers required to interface with the Aegis spindle. For over 600 years, the matriarchs of my bloodline had not been serving the Alliance. They had been silently preparing to enslave it, waiting for the perfect moment to seize control of the precursor fortress and force every other civilization to kneel beneath their absolute orbital supremacy. Before I could fully process the staggering weight of my family's generational treason, a secondary communication relay violently overrode the chamber's ancient audio feeds. A towering, translucent holographic projection of matriarch Oressa materialized directly above the control console. She was broadcasting from the safety of her heavily armored flagship, firmly believing she had secured a private, encrypted channel to the core after detecting my biometric login. She looked down at me, her face twisted into a mask of supreme, venomous arrogance. She did not see a rebellious niece. She saw a final, minor obstacle. "You are a disappointment, Lyrax," Oressa spat, her voice echoing harshly against the spherical walls. "You stand inside the ultimate seat of power, a weapon designed specifically for our bloodline, and you attempt to turn it off. You side with these primitive, mud-crawling humans over your own divine right to rule." I kept my bleeding hand pressed firmly against the glass, my eyes locked onto her towering projection. "You sent your own son to die, Oressa. You handed Corin a loaded biometric bomb, knowing exactly what a heavily armed terrestrial soldier would do to him." Oressa offered a cold, dismissive laugh. It was the sound of a sociopath who had entirely detached from the concept of maternal love. Corin was a spectacularly blunt instrument. He was arrogant, foolish, and entirely expendable. His deployment offered a perfect, binary outcome. If he somehow survived the biological transfer, he would have returned to Cerevia as the glorious conqueror who awakened the ancient gods. If the humans slaughtered him, as I statistically anticipated, he became the perfect, bloody flag for our holy war. His death gave me the legal mandate to wipe the terrestrial fleets from the void and claim this station during the chaos. He served his house perfectly. She smiled, a sharp, terrifying expression. "And now, I will finish what his sacrifice started. Step away from the console, Lyrax. Let the defense grid cleanse the docking rings." She was completely blinded by her own monumental hubris. She was so entirely focused on her impending victory that she failed to notice what my left hand was doing. While she delivered her grand, villainous monologue, I was rapidly bypassing the core's external communication firewall. I was not arguing with her to change her mind. I was keeping her talking. I keyed the final command sequence. "I am not stepping away, matriarch," I replied, my voice steady and amplified by the chamber's acoustics. "And I am not the only one evaluating your confession. I just routed this audio and visual feed directly into the central public address system of the Grand Arbitration Chamber. I also broadcast it on all unencrypted wideband frequencies to every single Alliance and terrestrial vessel currently in orbit. Everyone is listening." The towering holographic projection of Oressa froze. The terrifying realization washed over her aristocratic features, shattering her immaculate composure instantly. Her mask of the grieving, victimized mother was completely obliterated in front of the entire civilized galaxy. But the fortress was still armed. The countdown to the automated firing sequence was still ticking away in the background. Beside me, Gunnery Sergeant Alara Vance dropped to one knee. The physical toll of the interface was catastrophic. The ancient system was aggressively pulling the residual quantum signature from her cybernetic implants, using her nervous system as a raw data conduit. Blood began to pour from her nose and the corners of her eyes. The silver subdermal wiring along her jawline glowed with a terrifying, blinding heat. She was experiencing the biological equivalent of holding a live, high-voltage plasma cable with her bare hands. "Vance!" I shouted over the rising hum of the core. "The feedback loop is tearing your implants apart. You have to break the connection." She did not lift her hand from the liquid glass. Her muscles locked in rigid, agonizing defiance. "Negative, adjudicator," she ground out between clenched teeth, her breathing ragged and shallow. "If I drop the ghost print, the system defaults back to the hostile lockdown. I hold the line until you kill the firing sequence. Do it." She was enduring unimaginable kinetic and neurological torture to buy me the seconds I needed. I turned back to the glowing runes, summoning every ounce of my legal training. I did not just need to shut down the guns. I needed to legally sever Oressa's authority over the station forever. I initiated an emergency jurisprudential override, a highly archaic legal protocol reserved only for acts of supreme treason against the Cerevian state. I uploaded the decrypted files gathered by Tarek Vale, proving the Hollow Mandate's conspiracy, and formally married them to the live, recorded confession Oressa had just broadcasted to the fleet. By the sovereign blood of Tarek Vale, and invoking the absolute authority of the First Directorate, I declared, my voice ringing with the heavy, undeniable weight of the law. I officially designate Matriarch Oressa Thale as an active, hostile enemy of the Cerevian people. I revoke all proxy access, nullify her command codes, and authorize an immediate, permanent total system stand down. The liquid glass beneath our hands flared with a blinding, purifying white light. The ancient artificial intelligence processed the legal injunction, verified the treason against its own foundational directives, and accepted the override. The central holographic display shifted one final time, projecting the ultimate, undeniable truth of the entire crisis. It displayed a microsecond by microsecond breakdown of the incident on the Grand Promenade exactly 14 days ago. It explicitly defined the parameters of Corrin's biological attack. The AI confirmed that the physical slap was the final, required biometric motion to permanently unlock the subterranean armory. The system displayed the exact temporal threshold. The biological transfer required exactly 3.05 seconds of uninterrupted physical and proximity connection to breach the point of absolutely no return. Gunnery Sergeant Alara Vance had shattered his kinetic structure and terminated his biological functions in exactly 3.04 seconds. She did not overreact. She did not execute him out of anger. The United States Marine had severed the apocalyptic firing chain with a margin of exactly 1/100th of a single second. The system officially logged her lethal countermeasure, not as a hostile action, but as a perfectly executed, sanctioned planetary defense maneuver. The white light pulsed outward, echoing up the massive descent shaft. Above us, the horrific groaning of the ancient artillery batteries ceased. The heavy precursor cannons, which had been seconds away from vaporizing the human heavy cruisers, powered down and slowly retracted back into their hidden silos. The localized communication jamming fields evaporated. My datapad instantly flooded with hundreds of tactical updates. Aboard the Cerevian flagship, the grand, theatrical tragedy had reached its brutal conclusion. Oressa Thale's own elite honor guards. Having just listened to her publicly admit she was willing to sacrifice millions of their own people and her own flesh and blood merely to secure absolute power, drew their kinetic weapons and placed her under immediate, heavy military arrest. The fleets powered down their plasma lances. The war was over before the first shot was ever fired. Alara finally collapsed onto the metal grating, gasping for air as the connection severed. I dropped to my knees beside her, exhausted, battered, but completely alive. We had held the line. The Neutral Arbitration Council did not issue a minor, technical verdict that day. Following the undeniable revelations from the Corps, they delivered a monumental, historical ruling that shook the foundations of interstellar politics. Gunnery Sergeant Alara Vance was cleared of all charges. Her actions were legally enshrined as fully justified, proportionate, and undeniably heroic. She was formally recognized by the Alliance not as a primitive brute, but as the sole individual who saved the Aegis Spindle and millions of innocent souls from absolute annihilation. Weeks later, I sat quietly in my new, temporary office at the terrestrial embassy, writing my final, heavily classified report on the incident. My life as a Cerevian aristocrat was over, but my new life as a liaison to humanity had just begun. I looked out at the stars, reflecting on the profound absurdity of history. I knew exactly how the civilian galaxy would remember this event. For decades to come, The massive data networks would circulate the story under a sensational, highly reductive headline. They would always remember it simply as the day an arrogant alien slapped a United States Marine in public and was killed in 3 seconds flat. But I know the absolute truth, hidden beneath that viral spectacle. I know that was the exact day humanity proved they did not climb out of their gravity well and enter the cosmos just to bow down to ancient, rotting empires. They stepped into the dark void to stand their ground, to hold the line, and to physically stop the oldest, most arrogant civilizations from destroying themselves. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Sci-Fi Stories channel, drop a like on the video, and make sure to hit that hype button so this story can be heard by many more people around the world.